Hello everyone. So today we're going to be talking about chapter 6, which looks at emotional and social development in infancy and toddlerhood. Now, I'm not sure if you guys remember, but when we started this course, we talked about different theories that we would be using. We hadn't gone over them in a lot of detail, but we had discussed different theories, and we sort of broken them down and categorized them into stage theories versus more continuous kind of theories, like theories that look at development as a stage-wise process versus as a continuous process. So theories that look at development as a series of stages. This is the best diagram that sort of represents such theories, because what it does is these theories sort of posit that each step here, right, is a stage which is marked by, so this is stage 1, let's say, right, this is stage 2, this is stage 3, this is stage 4, this is stage 5, and each stage here, right, the difference between each stage here is that each stage is qualitatively different from the stage that is right next to it. So there's a qualitative difference in all of these different stages, right? So what happens is that as you're going from stage 1 to stage 2, you're either learning a new skill, or you are gaining in some sort of development. Perhaps you have suddenly gained in perceptual development, in some form of cognitive development. As we go on in this chapter, we'll see how children during the stage, when we're talking about infancy and toddlerhood, we're basically considering the years from 0 to 2, right? So this is our age range here, right? So we'll be looking at how self-awareness is growing during this time period, right? So we'll also look at whether that's a stage-wise process or if it's a continuous process, right? A continuous process is better depicted by this kind of graph, which is basically showing development as cumulative, right? So it's happening over time. This is basically development against time, right? This curve, this is what it's showing you, that you have the dimension of time here and you have development happening here, right? And this is what it shows you, is that it's a accumulation. So there are no stages, there are no abrupt gains in any kind of development as there are here when you jump from one stage to the other. Rather, it's a gradual process when you look at this continuous kind of development. So basically, this is theories that posit a more stage wise process. They look at development as happening through stages, and this is the kind of theories that follow a more continuous pathway, or that look at development in a more continuous sense. So why are we discussing this? We're discussing this as a sort of review, so that we can start talking about social emotional development in infancy and toddlerhood, and we can look at one of the first theorists who talked about social and emotional development and how it develops across the lifespan. And we have taken his name earlier when we've talked about the chapter on theories. Basically, who we are considering at the moment is someone we call Erik Erikson. Now, Erik Erikson was basically a psychoanalyst, right? But he differed from Freud in the sense that he also placed a lot of emphasis on psychosocial development. So, Freud was more about psychosexual development, but Erik Erikson was more about psychosocial development. So he, recognized that the social milieu, or the social climate, right, of a person's environment, that played a very important role in their development, right? Now, Erik Erikson posed this theory of development, which is a stage theory. It's essentially a stage theory of development. We've looked at Piaget's cognitive developmental theory in the previous chapter. That is also a stage theory of development. Likewise, when we consider social emotional development, right? So when we consider the first 2 years, according to Erikson, stage 1, which is here, right, consists of this basic, and at every stage of development, according to Erikson, what happens is there is some sort of conflict, right? So with each stage, according to Erikson, this theory is a stage theory. With each stage, there comes some form of conflict, right? And that conflict can be resolved in either of two ways, right? So, either it can be resolved in a more positive direction, which would be good for development, or it can be resolved in a more negative manner, which would be detrimental towards emotional development, right? So the conflict that we have for stage 1, right, which is basically 0 to 1 years, right, is something that Erikson calls, he terms it basic trust versus mistrust. Now, what does this really mean? This means that, and at this age, you have to keep in mind that, this is 0 to 1 years. So the role of the parents is humongous. It's huge. How the parents are, treating the child. The role of the parents, perhaps you can argue for this, that it's huge at all sorts of ages. But at this particular age, right, the role of the parents is very important. When you're perhaps, an adult, when you're married, when you have your own children, perhaps you can say, in some sorts of cultures that the role of parents is now not as much, or it's not as crucial for your own development or your own happiness or your own contentment. But here, the role of the parents is extremely, extremely influential, right? So basically, a child, if they are given, attention, if their needs are met, right? If they're not ignored, if their needs are met in a timely manner, right? If they're taken care of, right? So according to Erikson, what they'll develop is something called basic trust, right, in the world around them, that they will believe that they will be taken care of, right? Whereas if this is not the case, right, if their needs are neglected, right, so here what we have is that their needs are being met timely, and these can be a variety of needs. So children this young do not need to just be fed. They also need, time with their caregivers, in which they're held, in which they're loved. They also need to feel that they're valued, right? There's such a term, it's called psychosocial dwarfism. So this is basically when children do not receive the care that they need, or the emotional support that they need. And what you see is that these sort of children, they tend to become a lot more, let's say, they start losing out on a lot of physical development because of this as well, right? There's another term which is called, and this is used for very young children, the age range that we're considering, which is called inorganic failure to thrive. And what inorganic failure to thrive is that even though with a child or with an infant, right, all their basic physical needs are being met, but because their emotional needs or their social needs are not being met, what happens is that they start to lose out on the physical development as well. They start losing weight, they start becoming weaker, right? So basically what I'm trying to emphasize on here is that if a child's needs are met timely, and these needs are not only physical, but also emotional, right? If they're crying, if they're upset, if they're, for example, overwhelmed with something, and the caretakers deal with that, the caregivers, sorry, deal with that in a timely fashion. They pick up the child, they comfort the child, right? So then that develops something that Erikson terms basic trust, right? That they develop this basic, understanding that the world is a place where they will be taken care of, right? Now the conflict here is that it's basic trust versus mistrust, right? If their needs are not met in a timely manner, right? So here you have needs not being met or needs being neglected. Then what you will do is that this conflict here which you had, which was the conflict of this stage, right? The stage which spans from 0 to 1 years is basic trust versus mistrust. So then this conflict will be resolved on the mistrust side, that a child will start believing that the world is not a place where they will be taken care of. Rather, the world is a place that they should, mistrust, or they will develop, this sort of understanding that it's a place where they are not going to be taken care of. Right? So this is basically, the first, my apologies for that. So this is, the first socio-emotional conflict, according to Erikson, which marks the first stage, right? So this is basically, here we have trust versus mistrust, right? But because, when we're talking about this chapter, when we're talking about chapter 6, we're talking about infancy and toddlerhood, which means that we are spanning this to 2 years. So then we also need to consider stage 2, which takes us from 1 year to 2 years. Right? Now, what is the conflict here? Another thing that you need to remember is that, what is happening at the 1 year mark with children in terms of physical development. And that this is something very important, that whenever you're considering development, you consider, development in all of its different dimensions, right? So you have to remember that physical, cognitive, and emotional development, right, they influence one another, right? So it's not that you can look at any one of these in isolation. You always have to consider that they're interwoven. If there's development in one dimension, that will have consequences for the excuse me for that for the other dimensions as well, right? So at 1 year of age, what we see is that a child begins to walk, right? Not just that, a child is gaining in a variety of different skills. Those are, gross motor skills and fine motor skills, right? So walking is a gross motor skill, right? They're gaining in more fine motor skills as well, like, they're not yet really able to, but they're learning to use a spoon, or they're trying to do it, right? So they're making all of these different attempts as well, right? Now, what is happening as a child is learning to walk, or if a child is, most children take their first steps around their first birthday, right? Or what is happening when they are learning to use a spoon by themselves? They are gaining in something which we call autonomy, right? And this is basically the conflict of stage 2, which is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So again, parental role is extremely important here as well, right? How is parental role important? That, children
are becoming more autonomous. They're learning to walk, which means that they do not have to be carried all the time, right? They're trying to learn how to eat by themselves. So they're trying to, fiddle with a spoon. They might be dropping food all over the place, but they're still trying, right? As their fine motor skills are becoming more developed, right? Now, parents could do either of two things at this juncture. So they could either be overly critical. So let's say if a child is trying to feed themselves and they drop food, right? A parent could resort to screaming at them or saying to them, no, please don't do it by yourself. Please don't try to do it by yourself. Let me feed you. Let's just take a break until the azan ends and then let's continue. Otherwise, I don't think you guys will be able to hear me. Right. So we were looking at the example of, we could, if a child is trying to feed themselves using a spoon and they're dropping food all over the place. So there could be two things that a parent could do. Either, a parent could say to them that, this is not okay and, stop trying to feed yourself and stop this activity right now. Let me feed you. Or the parent could encourage them. They could say, it's fine, it's okay, you dropped some food, I'll pick it up, that's okay, and try to teach them to be more efficient in the usage of a spoon. Or let's say if a child is trying to put something in a particular bag, right, and they're trying to do it by themselves, because you have to remember that this is the age at which children are becoming more autonomous. What does autonomy mean? That they're becoming more independent, right? One thing could be that you put it in the bag for them. Another thing could be that you're more patient and you let them experiment with it, on their own. You let them try it on their own, right? So, each of these reactions will have different outcomes. If you obviously scream at a child for having dropped food while they're trying, their skills are not yet developed to the point at which they can perform this activity perfectly, feeding themselves with a spoon, right? But if you're patient with them, if you're encouraging them to keep trying, right, what will that do? That will help them build autonomy, right? Whereas, so with encouragement and patience from the parents, right, that will lead to autonomy, right? Whereas with discouragement, if a parent is discouraging and is impatient with the child, right, so that may lead to something like shame and doubt in a child's, in them thinking about their own ability, in them thinking about what they are and are not able to perform. So yes, so till now, keeping till this chapter, these are the two stages that we consider. Namely, stage 1 is basic trust versus mistrust, right? And stage 2 is stage 1 spans from 0 to 1 years of age, right? And stage 2 spans from 1 year to 2 years of age. And this is autonomy. So either the child will develop autonomy or they will develop shame and doubt, right? So these are the two stages that we look at when we're considering social and emotional development in infancy and toddlerhood, right? Now, when we look at emotional development in children, what do we see? Now, we have a table here. Let me show you that. Right, so what this table does here is that it basically takes you to, it looks at various emotional milestones, right? Which a child, achieves during the first 2 years. Now, one of the things that you see is that at birth, what happens at birth? Now, you would think perhaps, with a newborn, there might not be a lot of, emotions that a newborn shows. But what we do see is that a newborn usually, normally has the capacity to express certain basic emotions, right? And these are 7 basic emotions. So when we talk about basic emotions, right, what do we mean? Basic emotions are mostly emotions that are not just present in human beings, right, but they've been shown to be present in primates as well. And what we see is that they're usually very easily discernible through facial expressions, right? So, what are these 7 basic emotions, right? So, one of them is happiness, right? Another one is fear, right? Then we have sadness, right? We have disgust, right? We have something called interest, and we also have here something that's called, yes, so we have anger. That's also a basic emotion. So these basic emotions are universal in human beings and primates, right? And we have surprise, yes, right? So mostly what you see is that, what do you think? Do you think the ability to express basic emotions, do you think that would be present when a child is just born? So the answer to that is that, there seems to be some evidence of some basic emotions, but mostly at birth, right? What infants are usually doing is that they have these 2 global arousal states, right? And what are these 2 global arousal states? The first basically is that they are attracted to pleasant stimulation, right? That pleasant stimulation can come in the form of, let's say, the mother's touch, because you have to remember that at this age, even when children are born, they recognize the mother's smell, and they also recognize her voice, right? So, the mother's presence can be, or the mother's touch can be, a pleasant stimulation, right? Withdrawal from unpleasant stimulation, right? So, what can unpleasant stimulation be? So, perhaps unpleasant stimulation can come in the form of an extremely loud noise, perhaps, uncomfortable temperature, right? Any feeling of discomfort that might come in the form of, let's say, a dirty pamper, a dirty nappy, right? So all of that might be unpleasant stimulation. So, at birth, what children usually show is that, they are attracted to pleasant stimulation, and they mostly withdraw from unpleasant stimulation, right? Even though there is some evidence that they show some of the basic emotions that we've talked about here as well, right? Perhaps not so much sadness, but they do show some level of interest, and you can also interpret that as sort of attraction to pleasant stimulation. But yes, so let's stick to um, our discussion here, right? Then by 2 to 3 months, what you start seeing is that infants start showing happiness, right? Or they start displaying happiness. And that is, a basic emotion right here. So what you do see is that there is the development of what is termed the social smile. And that comes as early as 2 to 3 months. Then later, another thing that you see is that happiness begins to be displayed by laughter, right? That comes a little later, around 4 months plus. And what you see is that mostly, children initially, when they start laughing, they'll usually laugh at, a parent quickly saying something like, "I'm going to come get you," and they will, sort of giggle at that. And one of the things that you see is that after 6 months of age, children usually laugh more around their caregivers than they do around people that they do not recognize and who are strangers, right? Then so at 2 to 3 months, it's not just that they are smiling. The social smile, it's basically called a social smile because at birth as well, infants do smile, but it's usually in response to something like passing gas. Social smile comes about when they recognize, so it also comes about when there is a gain in perceptual development, right? And that gain in perceptual development comes about in the form of them beginning to recognize faces. So they look at a face and they know that this is another person, and they will smile at the face, right? So that's the difference. That's why it's called a social smile, because the smile is there even before this, but this is in response, or this is part of a social interaction, unlike the earlier smile, which is just, it might be some form of a reflex, right? And so at 2 to 3 months, you have social smiling and response in kind to adults' facial expressions, right? So there might be some level of imitation here, right? So whatever, if you try making faces at a baby, they might be imitating your expressions. Now, at 3 to 5 months, you have laughter and active stimuli. Infants perceive facial expressions, right? And another thing is that they can match the emotion in voices and faces. So let's say that, you have a sad face here, right? And you have a happy face here. So at this point, if you play two different sounds to a child, one is a happy sort of sound, or someone talking in a happier tone, and another is a sad sort of tone, someone talking in a sad tone, right? They will be able to recognize that this is the person who is, responsible for the happy sound, and this is the person who is talking in a manner which is more sad, right? So they're able to match facial expressions to vocal expressions, right? What happens when they're 6 to 8 months? Right, then what you see from 6 to 8 months is that expressions of the basic emotions that we've looked at earlier, they become more well organized. What you see is that they start, varying in a very meaningful manner with environmental changes, right? You have infants who start to become angry more often. So this is again, interesting that the basic emotion of anger here, right, is becoming more profound. And what you see is that they start displaying anger in more often, so frequency increases, right? And another thing is that they start being angry in a variety of different contexts. Now, why may this be? Now, researchers suggest a number of reasons. One of them is that, around this age, children are learning something that's called effortful control, right? Which is basically that they're learning as physical and cognitive development is happening. So as their cortical regions are becoming more advanced, are becoming more developed. Effortful control, which means basically that they have more control over their behavior, that their behavior is becoming more voluntary, right? So as they start to have more control over their actions, right, they start to become more angry or frustrated because they want to be able to control more of their actions, right? So that is one explanation why children start displaying more anger around this stage, right? But what you need to remember is that's one explanation. There may be more. It might be that they're having, some sort of trouble understanding their own emotions. That's something we come to when we talk about emotional self-regulation.